let me just say thank you very much for inviting us to this webinar and for letting us share this project. So yes, the title of this project is Using Images to Explore Chinese International Students' Understandings and Experiences of Loneliness. And a very quick introduction. So in the 2020 and 2021 academic year, of the international students that enrolled in UK universities, about 26% of them were made up of Chinese international students, which is a very large percentage. And although research suggests that Chinese international students are at a higher risk of suffering from adverse effects of the cultural disparities which exist between their home and host culture, there's very limited research that focuses on understanding what exactly loneliness means to Chinese international students and how they experience this feeling. So in this study, which is part of a 3-phase study that we did, we conducted 15 in-depth semi-structured interviews with Chinese international students to explore how they experience and understand loneliness. And something that's quite unique to this project is that we invited participants to share their thoughts and experiences using images. So this was in the form of either drawings, photos, online images, etc., to better enhance the communication and to overcome any potential language barriers. So as mentioned, this was a 3-phase project. So we'll only be focusing on phase 1, which is the interviews. And for this project, we also conducted it using a PAR approach, participatory action research, and included 3 co-researchers in addition to myself in the data collection process. And our 3 co-researchers who were really amazing for this project were 2 students from the University of Strathclyde who are PhD students, and 1 student from UCL down in London. So here's a very quick overview of the participant demographics. In addition to the usual age, gender, university, course, and duration in the UK, we also asked participants which cities and provinces in China that they derived from, because we felt as if this would illustrate a bit more diversity and add a little bit more almost individuality to the group, as opposed to just using a very general blanket term of students from China, as they're often referred to in research. So very quickly, some example questions that we included in the interview schedule was like, how do people understand loneliness in Chinese culture, and how do you define loneliness, etc. So in the next few slides, we'll just be discussing how we analyze the data and then some preliminary findings as well. So we used the Brown and Clark reflective thematic analysis, and student co-researchers were also involved throughout the analysis process. So we found, let me just reduce the screen. So regarding the preliminary findings, we identified 3 main themes with some associated sub-themes, including lack of intimate, authentic, and understanding social relationships. So this was more about the desire to fulfill an emotional and psychological connection, and the sub-theme of absence of close social circles and familiar culture. And then theme 2 was the adaptation process and belongingness. So this fell under 2 sub-themes, including disconnection from the academic community and working towards integration, and challenges of intercultural communication, which largely circulated around the cultural differences, including language. And then the final theme was about withholding feelings and the preference for a self-reliant problem-solving coping. So this also fell under 3 sub-themes, including the limitations of culture and language barriers and support services, sub-theme 2, avoidance or self-care, and sub-theme 3, acceptance, transition, and reaching out. So in the following slides, I will just quickly show you some examples of the images and the associated themes that they fell under, and describe a little bit more about them. So for the first theme, one picture that I've decided to pick out was from one participant who showed a picture of a snowman. So they described this picture in relation to their loneliness by saying during that day they were quite upset by seeing the snow, And although they were happy to go outside and build a snowman, they realized that there was no one that they could share this picture of this first experience of playing with snow with. And they said that even though they built the snowman to be quite happy, they were ultimately feeling quite sad and quite lonely at that time. And in relation to their loneliness, we analysed this to suggest that perhaps happy experiences and memories can be shrouded by the realization that you are alone and you have no one to share these experiences with. And moreover, the portrayal of happiness might not reflect the true feelings of loneliness within the participants themselves. And another picture, as you can see, there's just this little character who is facing the back of a potted plant. And the participant described this image by saying, "I think this flower just stands for the beautiful outside world, but I just face this with my back." So during that time, it's almost as if like the future is promising, it's beautiful, but they don't feel as if they feel very disconnected from the world outside. And they also said that it feels as if they have friends, and even though they were quite busy, they still felt lonely. So we talk about this theme in relation to the sub-theme of feeling understood, and it's about almost as if the feeling of homesickness and moving away from familiar social circles can cause feelings of sadness and loneliness. And the feeling of disconnection from your family may also translate into how you feel about the world around you, and it can lead to almost the development of a negative disposition towards life. And as mentioned by this participant, they almost felt sort of detached and unable to feel or see anything that was potentially positive or happiness in their study abroad experience. And theme 2, there's a picture of someone just a computer, and it's about the adaptation process and belongingness. And basically in this picture, they talked about how the cultural differences in relation to their supervisor, who they felt as if supported their academic development as opposed to any other development, was quite a lonely experience, and they felt unsupported and disconnected with their academic community. And mindful of the time, I'll just quickly talk about this final theme, and it's about just this picture of the space and the moon. And basically this participant talked about how in their family and in their culture, loneliness was not openly discussed, and hiding loneliness and feeling as if they were not able to acknowledge or show awareness of their loneliness was considered almost like an act of denial of this feeling. And however, they felt as if changing this mentality of loneliness and being able to accept this feeling was helped them to feel a bit more positive and understand that loneliness is a part of life. And overall, the thoughts of using this imagery from the participants were that images can be beneficial to help students and help people convey their feelings, and it can improve expression of thoughts, feelings, and to better illustrate feelings that cannot be described by words. And it can also help to bridge limitations of language barriers. And that is all. I'm sorry for going over a bit over the time, but thank you very much for letting me share this project.
That's brilliant, Yvonne, thank you. So there's no questions in the chat just yet, but I'll give a brief pause in case anyone would like to unmute and ask any immediate clarification questions for Yvonne.
Will I stop sharing the screen now?
Yeah, if you don't mind, Yvonne, thank you. Brilliant. In that case, and just to say for the remaining talks, if there are any questions that appear, you're welcome to pop them in the chat, because if we don't address them immediately, we can, Joe and I can bring them back into the Q&A at the end. So we're now going to move on to talking about academic unbelonging with Gopinder. Brilliant. I can see your slides there, Gopinder.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so thank you for, again, and the opportunity to share the project update. I'm Gopin Dalali. I'm based at the University of Wolverhampton, and I'm one of the project members. Dr. Lydia Lewis, unfortunately unable to join us today, is the lead investigator. So I'm presenting on Lydia's behalf here today. And what we've done,
Gopinder,
yeah,
sorry to interrupt. Could you just put your PowerPoint in presentation mode so that the slides become full screen?
yeah, sure.
Just so we can see them a bit more clearly. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
No, not a problem. That's great. Thanks for letting me know. Yeah, so we were kind of at the stage of developing the findings. So we've got some preliminary findings here. I'd kind of like to share a bit about the project, the rationale, method, the conceptual framework as well in particular, and yeah, some stories from students. But ultimately, we proposed a project which captured the doctoral students' experiences of what we kind of termed academic and non-belonging within the neoliberal higher education environment. And it was a comparative institutional case study to English universities based in the Midlands, and for reasons of anonymity, of course, unable to identify those. So yeah, in terms of the context, then this kind of neoliberal discourse that we draw on, we all know how that's been, that has shaped kind of academia, and is kind of, to put it bluntly, part of the problem, in which we've created a more of a performative culture, which has leads to these mental health and well-being related issues. So we were interested particularly in the doctoral study because it seemed to be quite underreported and under-researched as an area. We know about the kind of attainment gap at undergraduate level. What we wanted to do was look at minority groups in particular, but not just minority groups, those kind of, I'd say, white British groups, if you like, but trying to unpack that a little bit, because there's a number of discourses at play there, that are kind of higher education policy itself is classed, gendered, racialized. So very much taking a sociological stance here. And the pressure of the neoliberal discourses at play, which was very much made of the context, and this kind of how this doctoral study is instrumentalized. And the previous research kind of highlights the emotional intensity of these programs, the stress, mental health issues linked to kind of isolation and lack of support. And then we set out with an aim to explore the lived experiences of academic belonging among a diversity of postgraduate research students across what we decided to use. And I don't like to go into binaries here, but pre-92 universities and post-92 universities, which are newer universities. And those, I think broadly speaking, I would say there's kind of an in-between as well, where this kind of notion of a pre-92 university is one which is a little bit more research rich, and post-92 being a bit more teaching intensive. And there are others that exist in between, and we're not kind of disregarding those, but this was our focus in terms of framework. And navigating that was quite messy. And again, the neoliberal higher education environment, which applies to the education sector more broadly anyway. And the conceptual framework then we decided to go with was this understanding belonging. And this idea that we'd place an importance of social locations, individuals' identifications and attachments. And also taking an intersectional approach, and how thinking of belonging in a post-colonial era, and then kind of using Christensen's notion of unbelonging to move forward and make sense of some of the data, which I'll come to talking about shortly. So again, in interest of time, just presenting this screen here in terms of our methodological approach. We took a very much a participatory and action-oriented approach. So we wanted to try and, the end goal in terms of impact of this work is that we want to see this embedded within our institutions. And we're not at that stage yet. We've got findings, And now we're talking to stakeholders both internally and externally to try and bring these, these findings to fruition, really. So there were 4 stages. The foundational work, setting the website, etc., engaging with stakeholders, a lit review, field work where we conducted 8 focus groups with doctoral students across the 2 universities, a sample of 29. And the areas of which, was partly driven by opportunity sample, where education and applied health research. And then stage 3 was feedback of doctoral students and consultation. The discussion of themes that emerged. And then fourthly, the stakeholder consultation. So we've been engaging in a number of workshops and dissemination activities, if you like, throughout the process, just to member check and also present, participants with data and say, this is what we've come to arrived at. Does it reflect the focus group activity? And then final reporting. And at a glance, guys, focus group participants by ethnicity, gender, and with the home or international students. Okay, I'm happy to share this with anybody who wishes to look at it in closer detail after the session. Initial findings then. Dimensions of academic belonging. What belonging to what exactly? There were different levels, because in education, for instance, we found, when I say I'm talking about education as a discipline, like a school of education, we found that there were students engaged, or participants even, enrolled on PhD programs, more traditional routes of 8,000 words independent study, versus we also have a professional doctorate, which is referred to as an EdD or ProfDoc at both institutions actually. And this was a shorter word count, but there will be the first 2 years of study would be module driven, so assignments, structured learning, and then a lot of those, across both programs, participants / students were members of staff who were already lecturers working in the university, and had a lot of experience working in schools and classrooms, etc. And some were doing, engaged in doctoral study that weren't necessarily attached. So there were different levels of belonging in terms of those who felt like researchers, but for example, teacher before researcher, and others were just researchers. And there's this idea of materialized belonging and symbolic connections, and that relational understanding, importance and paucity of kind of research assistant and teaching assistant opportunities, curricula, negotiating that curricula, how did that come into play? This kind of notion of action-based research for those who are already in teaching positions. This kind of notion that we're taking the abstract ideas and turning them into, how do we operationalize those in the everyday? And this importance of administration for institutional belonging as well. How did that play in to understandings of belonging and unbelonging across these two, what we term different types of institutions with different types of pressures? And academic belonging and institutional and social positionings were at play very much there. Just a couple of quotes there from students here and participants, sorry, should I say. Kind of tensions between academic belonging versus neoliberal academic unbelonging. So I feel like I've made a home within academia, but university has definitely not helped me in doing so. And whether I fit into it, I don't actually care, because it was never made for me, and therefore I don't actually want to be part of what it currently still is. Students recognizing this kind of neoliberal discourse. And I'm going to just quickly move on there. And then we kind of talk about this disidentifications, almost, the values and the conflict in neoliberal cultures. It kind of makes you do things that you don't want to, because you feel like you have to in this type of performative cultures. And we also had the resistance to the pressures associated with those neoliberal academic discourses, conversely. And we had this disidentification then with, or personal distancing from academia altogether. And that would be typically from students who are mature or from working class backgrounds, perhaps. And just recognizing there that that's just from a class background. And then you've got kind of gender at play, you've got ethnicity at play, which adds additional layers. And then the other point here, just to kind of drawing to a conclusion, not feeling, non-belonging. Working in universities, helping combat feelings of non-belonging or imposter syndrome sometimes does help. The difference between belonging and not feeling that you don't belong. And also the issue of whether people want a sense of belonging from their universities. We can't just assume that. And then this appropriation in neoliberal discourse that we need to contend with. So very complex in that respect. Another quote, I wouldn't say that I felt connected or belonged because, again, it's just a different mindset, I don't live and breathe this. It's something that I'm doing as a side, I have a life outside of this, so I'm not kind of embracing, there is a world beyond academia. And this kind of acceptance and expected non-belonging. I didn't expect to belong, and that sounds quite sad. I don't. I'm used to going into spaces where you are the minority of the minority of a minority. And then there is a snobbishness about university. There's an eliteness, there's kind of cultural capital associated here. So do you have a right to be here? And that was from a Black Caribbean participant, female student in a pre-92, right? Again, so just concluding here, and I'm running out of time. So what kinds of responses do the findings indicate? Just going to touch on a couple of these. The value of department-based administration for doctoral students. There's work to counteract troubling psychosocial experiences associated with neoliberal culture, such as feelings of isolation, competition, and stress. And this idea, the importance of space and place is so critical here into the context. And what are the implications for teaching and learning then? How are we going to try and make sense of this and operationalize? So there's a lot of value in critically engaging with the democratic participatory approaches. Universities are places of, should be a place of, of promoting the democratic way. If they aren't critical institutions, what are they? So again, decolonizing and negotiating curricula. We need to think about that. We need to think about inducting students, doctoral students. We can't just assume that you're working at, a doctoral student, you're familiar with the system. Not necessarily. Induction through different spaces, helping build that social capital, where cultural capital might be at play, and empowering approaches to peer-led initiatives. So again, sorry to rush through there. Lots to say, lots to pick up on. Any questions, feel free to email me. It's been a pleasure presenting here today, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Gopinder. That was a very interesting talk. I know I certainly wrote down quite a few questions I'd like to bring into the discussion at the end. There are no immediate questions in the chat, so we'll move on to our next talk, which is looking at the well-being of students with caring responsibilities on behalf of Rebecca, Rachel, and Amy.
Would help if I unmuted myself before I start, wouldn't it? There we go. Can everyone see the slides okay?
That looks great. Thanks, Rebecca.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. So yes, thank you ever so much, everyone, for inviting us here and for listening to a talk today about our project, which is called Who Cares? Understanding and Supporting the Study, Work and Life Balance and Wellbeing of Students with Caring Responsibilities. So this project is led by Dr. Rachel Spacey and supported by me, Rebecca Sanderson. We're from the University of Lincoln, and it's also supported by Amy Zile from the University of East Anglia. Now, we are all researchers and we're students, and between us we have experience of caring while working and studying. So we have a personal as well as a professional stake in this research. Now, we're not going to talk about the findings of our research today. We're going to talk about how our project engaged with underrepresented groups, in this case, student parents and carers, who are less visible in higher education than we think they currently should be. So when we thought about engaging with our target groups, this is what we considered before we began the project. So the first thing was thinking about the evidence base, and there is lots of evidence, particularly from health research, that involving what are sometimes termed end users in developing research and interventions has got lots of benefits. So we took this kind of action research participatory approach, and we were looking to include as many of those end users as possible in the development of the project material. So things like the survey questions and the interview questions that we were going to use, and also in shaping the project outputs. So we needed to ask ourselves, who are these end users? And we had to think quite broadly about that. So we, of course, thought, well, student parents and carers themselves, they're the key group, but also student support services and student wellbeing services who are involved in helping them whilst they're studying, researchers in the field, and also third sector agencies who are involved in supporting young carers and also carers once they come to university. So these were all groups that would have an interest in the research and could potentially benefit from the findings. As well as thinking about these different groups, sometimes it's helpful to think about kinds of knowledge. So it was really important to have that knowledge of lived experience of care and study from the students, but it's also important to include the professional knowledge from those student wellbeing practitioners and the kind of academic knowledge from the researchers too. So we wanted to bring these representatives together from these groups to form a project steering group, and we modelled that group on a community of interest. So community of interest is a group with a shared interest but different experiences and perspectives relating to the topic. So we were very aware that there were some potential ethical implications that are unique to this approach, and we needed to mitigate those, but I'll touch on those briefly in a moment. So what we actually did, we created our steering group through using our own network. So Rachel and I work in widening participation, so we had quite extensive networks with students and professionals and working in student support as well. We use social media and we use targeted communications too. And we created this group which had 7 meetings over the course of the year of the project, and the group were asked to feedback on a range of issues which were critically important to the research. So to try and make this work as well as it could, we had to try and anticipate the kinds of barriers to participation that people might experience. So we know that some of the known issues for this particular group of students is time poverty and also conflicting commitments. So we tried to mitigate those barriers through making participation as flexible as we possibly could. We wanted to recognise the contribution of the steering group to the research. So for example, that was through remuneration for the students, but also acknowledging contributions in other ways and offering opportunities for further involvement, such as peer researchers. And above all, we wanted the group to have kind of meaningful influence, not just a tokenistic involvement. And that meant continually seeking feedback, acting on the feedback, and then reporting back on how we'd acted on that feedback. So finally, I just want to talk a bit about what we learned from going through this process. So the most important thing, I think, is that we learned to think about engagement in terms of quality and not quantity. The number of people who would attend a meeting or take part just wasn't a very good measure of engagement. And actually, sometimes the meetings that were the least well attended had the richest discussion. We needed to actively seek diversity in creating the steering group and also in securing that engagement with the research more widely. And that, of course, means thinking about diversity in terms of protected characteristics, which is really important. But it's also important in terms of the other characteristics that were relevant to the research. So, for example, we wanted to make sure that carers, as well as parents, would be actively involved, because we know from our literature searches and from our previous experience that carers are a group who are particularly overlooked in this area. So we learned a bit about using tech. We went in with the assumption that online video conferencing software would be great and this would really help enable remote participation. But what we actually found was it's not always as easy to access as we assumed. So we just had to keep having conversations with the group, inviting feedback, and making changes where we could. So for example, one of the early things we did was switch from Teams to Zoom because some people just couldn't access the meetings when they were held on Teams. But this issue of technology was a kind of ongoing problem for us as the project progressed. So flexibility of participation, something I've mentioned before, was really important. So that meant things like giving opportunities to take part asynchronously. So for example, feeding back by email, making an effort to find dates that suit everyone in the group, not just convenient dates for us, so using doodle polls and things like that. We also started offering additional meeting dates so that people would have a choice of times that they could attend, and that really helped. They could choose what suited them best. But the practical upshot of this is that it does take more resources. And this is something to bear in mind, I think, for anyone who's thinking about using these kind of more participatory approaches in their research. You've got to remember to allocate sufficient resources. So it's very time consuming to do research in this way. It's quite admin kind of heavy. It requires more investment in relationship building and communication than other approaches to research. And actually there is a risk that you can do more harm than good if you kind of promise active involvement in research and then you can't deliver it because you just don't have the resources. Another ethical issue that came up was this awareness of power dynamics, and this was really, really critical. People can very easily feel intimidated. As researchers, we enjoy status as experts, which we might always deserve it, but that's how people view us, and we have to create trust to make a safe environment so that people feel able to criticise and to contradict us. And that was really important because it was that criticism that made our research better and made it better serve this group of people. And finally, we wanted to make sure that participation in the steering group was beneficial. And that meant thinking beyond just the outputs that we wanted to see, the papers that we wanted to publish or the conferences that we wanted to speak at. Now, I think for probably everyone that's speaking here today, the key success measure of the project is making a positive difference to the groups that we're working with. So we really wanted to make a positive difference to student parents and carers, and that means offering and continuing to offer ongoing opportunities to be involved in project outputs, to be named, to shape what those project outputs are so that they're practically useful and will make a difference in the real world. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Rebecca. You covered a lot, but it was really, really fascinating. There are no immediate questions in the chat, but I will pause to give people an opportunity to unmute in case I have any immediate questions, just whilst I get my slides ready for the final talk. Do feel free to pop any questions in the chat whilst I remember how to share. There we go. Okay. Yeah. Can everybody see these slides? I'll take that as a yes. I can't hear anyone, but interrupt me, and I can't see anyone, but do please interrupt me.
No, we can, Emma. Yeah, we can.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jo. So I'm now going to spend a few minutes to talk about a project which is looking at developing pathways and partnerships between university and NHS mental health services. This research actually has quite a few different areas of it, but the main reason I'm talking about it today is to showcase the student co-production work that our student research group did. If you'd like to find out more about the toolkit, that QR code should work on the screen, and I'll pop the link in the chat towards the end. But just to give you a bit of context, when we're dealing with partnerships, what do we really mean by partnerships? So this is very much starting at the end of the journey. So these are some quotes from the students and the staff who we worked with when we tried to get them to explain why they think what the current state of mental health support services look like and why they think it might be helpful to develop these partnerships. Basically, when we talk to staff, they in blue here, they've said that a lack of joined up working between the support services means that there are gaps for students when they're transitioning between either in-house services or external services like NHS and charity services. And because of this confusing landscape, staff can often feel like that they are working defensively because it's not completely clear where to send a student. There's a lot of fear there about sending them the wrong place and delaying the help that they could be getting. And when we talk to students, we find that it's hard enough for them to reach out to seek support for their mental health or academic distress. But even if they do, we find that because it's quite a convoluted process, particularly when they're dealing with multiple services, they find that they are repeating their story over and over, and it can definitely stop them from reaching out in the future. And so the research team that was involved with this work, they believe that one of the ways to respond to some of these challenges is to essentially facilitate stronger alignment between university, NHS, third sector or charity services. and start to move towards a more coordinated sort of mental health care for students. So this idea of a whole university approach, seeing that we're all responsible for supporting our students. So with this in mind, the project had two aims. One was to firstly just characterise the state of partnerships that are already in place between mental health services in England, and then to develop a research-informed toolkit based on our learnings from the different hubs that we met. So there are 5 domains in total, but I'm going to focus on our first domain, which is about co-producing mental health partnerships with students. And I'd like to introduce you to our research team, our student research team, who led this work from the beginning. So they were split between UCL, Liverpool, Manchester, Sheffield, and UCL Yale. And these are really the hubs of the different regions that we met with to try to understand the partnerships that they had in place. I'm not going to go into detail about this slide. If you did want to find out more, we do cover these areas in the toolkit, but I just wanted to give you a quick background in terms of the methods that underpins the research in the toolkit. So there was a lot of consultation with students, so service users and non-users. That work was led by our students, and then we also engaged with professional staff across the 5 regional hubs. This is also backed up by related research such as focus groups and systematic reviews. And then as I'm sure you can appreciate, there's a lot of data, so a lot of the findings were combined, which was led by our student group. And that's really where the key domains of the toolkit came from, which is also why our student co-production domain is our first domain, because we really realise how important it is to engage with students and staff as early as possible when we're dealing with mental health partnerships, especially when we're looking at the types of data that's being collected. So I'm sure I don't need to go through too much detail about why it's important to co-produce or to work with students as co-creators, but I suppose a key few bullet points when we're looking at why it's helpful to co-produce when we're looking at partnerships is because really the students are the ones that are going through these services, or if they're not help seeking, then there are really valid reasons as to why they're not help seeking, and so it's critical for their voice to be at the centre here. I particularly like the bullet point around opening a dialogue that helps them to feel empowered. So what I didn't explain about our student research team is that actually none of them were from a psychology background, which meant that none of them had engaged with research before. So I particularly like that in Rebecca's talk, she talked about how you have to build in extra time for some of the relationship building. That was certainly something that we learned in this project, that you have to build in time to teach these sort of basic research skills when you're engaging with students that aren't from a discipline where they might have already done research methods, for instance. But we found that by engaging with these students, that it just really added a whole new richness to the data. And personally, I feel like it, well, based on what they sort of shared when they shared their experiences during the time, their confidence really grew throughout the project, because I remember some of our early meetings, so we had one student from marketing and another one from engineering, and to start with, they were really quite concerned about running these focus groups, because they said, I don't know anything about mental health, I'm not a practitioner, or I've never done research before, like what do I have to bring to the table? I've got nothing to bring to the table. And if we compare that meeting to the last meeting that we had, that really, well, by the end of it, they were writing academic papers about their experiences of engaging with students. So just from an outside point of view, it was really quite nice to see them flourish. So to give you a really brief idea about what our student team did in terms of what our goals were and what they did, well, they completely led. So this was led by Kirsty Nisbet at UCL. She was a student at the time, but she's now gone on to work at Anna Freud Centre. She led our co-production project with a medical student. So they led the development of our study materials and aims, our research questions. They took a lead in recruiting and reaching out to key student groups. Because they had the knowledge of their own campuses, they were able to identify key venues to recruit the key individuals we were trying to look at. And we did a 2-phased approach. The first phase of focus groups, which is for any student interested in engaging in this research. But we then encouraged our student research team to focus on a sort of targeted population that had some sort of meaning to them. We did a second phase of focus groups. So these were service users and non-users, to really try to identify their views and their experiences of trying to access mental health support services. So the groups that they identified with are listed from 1 to 4 here. They included focus groups with men and non-binary students. We had separate focus groups working with Black, Asian and minority ethnic students. We had some focus groups with Chinese international students, and finally students who were eligible for disability support. So just to quickly finish then on some of the views on partnerships. So when we're working, the reason why data is important when we're talking about partnerships is because there are different governance structures in place when a student might move from a university service to a non-university service. And in terms of streamlining their journey, we found that there are several barriers in place, just in the two services not being able to communicate some really basic information with each other. And so we thought that it was critical that students were at the heart of this conversation about what they want in terms of how their data is being handled, collected and shared. And so we've got some student concerns on the slide here, particularly around confidentiality when we're dealing with such sensitive data. Second one, this comes up a lot. There's a lot of debunking to do, that there is this fear that mental health data is somehow going to be shared with academic staff. And again, this can prevent them from reaching out in the future or at all. And really, I think there are a lot of doubts. We're very early on in this phase of trying to develop these partnerships. So we don't know if they're going to work or how they're going to work and if there are any risks involved. So that's all the more reason to co-produce these conversations with students and staff. But I just wanted to highlight the section in yellow. And so although there are a lot of uncertainties at this point, there were some potential silver linings that we could see from an early point, that these partnerships do have potential to maybe streamline access, so basically get students to where they need to go to sooner. And what's really key is that the students just want a say, they want to be involved in how we're developing these partnerships. So I'm sorry, I didn't realise how difficult that quote was to see. I just wanted to give you an idea of two contrasting quotes, particularly around the concerns of confidentiality. So for instance, this particular student is saying that they might not want certain information being disclosed to their university because they might have concerns that it might affect their ability to perform academically, or if they're a student on placement, for instance, often they rely on their academic supervisor to put a good word in for them. And some students describe that they would feel uncomfortable if an academic department was aware of them seeking help for their mental health support. But then on the flip side, this is an example from a student who had gone home over the Christmas period, and actually they felt like as long as they were able to provide permission for their information to be shared between their university and GP, then actually they felt that they could have perhaps gone to see someone sooner rather than having to go via them directly. So I just wanted to finish by thank you for listening, and just to say that if anyone is coming to the Smarten Showcase in person tomorrow, we're going to have a bit more of a discussion focusing on the data side of things with a longitudinal project from York University as well. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you everyone for talking. We will now hand over to find out if there are any questions. I can see lots of people saying, sort of requesting links and saying how interesting it has been. But if anyone does have any questions at all, do feel free to use the chat function or kind of come in on your mic and camera. They can be for a specific presentation, or they can be just more general ones. Oh, Jennifer.
Hiya. Thanks for all of those talks. I've got lots of questions for all of them, but I think I'm just going to stick with a general question for all of you. In your study, if you could think of one thing that surprised you about what you did, I'd love to hear about something that you were like, oh, I wasn't expecting that. Something that challenged any assumptions you had at the start of the project.
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you for your question. Yeah, I'm happy to take a start at that one. I think,
Love it.
yeah, I think I would say, even though I shouldn't be surprised at this, I was, because my understanding, it was more anecdotally focused initially, of this kind of the link, you know, the tensions between the pre-92 and the post-92 university, where actually the support offered, I thought, was, you know, this kind of notion that the support, you get more support in the post-92 versus a pre. Some of that was confirmed, but then I realized the nuances, because I quickly discovered a lot of the challenges across both institutions were similar. Teaching workloads were continuing to increase in the pre-92s, and because there's neoliberal discourse at play, those also play into supervision. So, for example, think of surveys. We have the PRES survey. You know, the focus on supporting the student and carrying them, you know, carrying them through their journey. And what was surprising was that actually there was a lot more support in the pre-92 universities than I originally thought, because I spent most of my time working in the post-92. Even though I've had some experience of working in the pre, there's very little. So I can only go on my lived experience of that. And part of the project team, we were made up of a group of researchers across those two universities, you see. So, and I think it was about our identities, professional and personal journeys that, you know, are so diverse. Those are assumed, you know, cannot be assumed. Can't think of the institution without thinking of the group or the individual and the participant themselves, the doctoral student, if you like. So it's so, you know, trying to explain that in numbers, it doesn't always paint the true picture. And that's what I quickly realized, that you know, having stories and developing personas, I think would be really good in trying to help illustrate, you know, what I'm trying to say here. So yeah, I hope that kind of makes sense.
Yeah,
It's
thank
very
you.
messy.
No, it's not. Makes sense.
I think for us, I'm not sure if Rachel's got anything she would like to say on this, but what really surprised me was the associations of the word care, which I had always thought of as a positive word. For some participants, they just didn't identify with that word, and it was seen to care for someone was like a professional's job. It was about personal care, or it was associated with sort of taking on a burden. So there's a kind of stigma around it, and we think that potentially might explain why often when research is done with students with caring responsibilities, that carers are quite underrepresented, perhaps because they don't see themselves in that word, if they're not as well, because caring relationships are quite complicated. So there can be people who care for different generations within their family, or have different levels of involvement at different times, particularly if someone's caring for someone who has sort of addiction or a mental health difficulty, which might fluctuate over time. So people found that word like very difficult, and I really hadn't expected that.
Thank you. Well, Rachel's just saying she agrees with you. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we haven't had any extra questions in the chat, but were you about to come in on something there?
right. Yeah, sorry, I just want to respond to Jennifer's question about something, you know, I won't describe it as a surprise, but it's something really interesting I noticed from the responses of our participants. So our project is, you know, we have a previous project focusing on Asian international students, and this project focuses on Chinese international students. And we have been talking about how to make our support services more culturally sensitive and appropriate. And we've been working pretty closely with our student mental health services on this. But in this process, I think it's quite important to note that the participants, the end users, you know, of the services might have concerns about developing something specifically for them, because a couple of participants in our project mentioned this concern to say that does that mean, you know, some kind of segregation in mental health services? Does that mean we can only go to the services designed for us? So I think it's something we need to bear in mind. Personally, I don't think there's anything wrong to you know, to make the services more culturally sensitive. But I think the overall purpose of doing that should be facilitating students to integrate into the wider community. If we don't have that more culturally sensitive and targeted support at the beginning, a lot of students, they may not have the opportunity or the ability to do that. But it's not the end point, it's just the starting point of supporting students. So I think it's something I find quite interesting from the responses of our participants. Yeah.
Thank you.
I was just going to quickly add to, I sort of mentioned it earlier, but what I found really refreshing was the benefits of working with students from different disciplines. I suppose it's really easy because I'm in psychology, so I'm always working in that research space. I think it's easy to take for granted not only how easy it might be to talk about mental health when you're working with psychology students, but also that they come with this interest and potentially this background awareness of how you might research it. So actually, I found it very beneficial working with students from different disciplines and trying to make the information more accessible so that we can have conversations about mental health in disciplines where they perhaps wouldn't usually be talking about these sorts of conversations.
Thank you.
I think, Neil, you have your hand up.
Yeah, Neil's got a hand up.
Yeah, hi there. Thanks very much. Can I ask two really quick? Oh, I'm lit in a really dramatic way. I see now my camera's on. Sorry about this. Like I'm in a horror film or something like that. Sorry about that. Could I ask two questions, both of which come from really like a position of ignorance, to be honest, because I'm kind of slightly new to these topics. One's about loneliness and one's about co-production. So the loneliness thing is, in my own mind, I don't know what loneliness is, and I noticed when in your presentations and also in the literature that I started to read. What loneliness seems to be is people saying that they're lonely. And I wondered, I feel that's quite a constraint on research, really, just kind of reports of loneliness without a kind of a slightly richer understanding of what loneliness might be. So I just kind of wondered whether you had kind of thoughts about, you know, maybe there are advantages in not theorizing loneliness more, but I wondered what people might think. And the second thing is with co-production, and in a way this relates to the things you were just saying right at the end there, Emma. You know how mental health care research is really contentious, and you've got kind of quite vicious really arguments for people on different sides. A substantial number of sensible people don't like thinking, say, of loneliness in terms of mental health, don't really like, you know, they are quite fiercely critical of mental health care, really, or psychology, or psychologizing distress. They think it's neoliberal, they think it's various sorts of things. I never know what to make of it, but I just recognize that how would you include them in the co-production process? You know, I mean, is there a kind of secret boundary marker or kind of gateway keeping that you have to kind of accept a psychological framing of distress to sort of be allowed into the co-production process? That are my two questions. Thanks.
So I had a couple of comments about the co-production, but also actually a follow-up question about your loneliness question, Neil. But I'll do the co-production one first. Personally, I find your question really interesting in terms of like how do we have conversations like outside of psychology. I suppose I'll give an anecdote from actually a project that I haven't talked about at all. A few years back, I did a project looking at the role of personal tutoring to remedy attainment gaps, and it was working in the Faculty of Engineering, Dentistry and Architecture. And the aim wasn't at all to discuss mental health. It was, why are there gaps? What can we do to remedy them? What's the role of personal tutoring? And I worked with students in engineering to facilitate focus groups of other students in engineering about attainment gaps. And what I found fascinating is that mental health kept on coming up, even though we weren't even asking about it. And I wasn't even analysing the data either, because I was really aware that I could have been biased. I have a history of doing mental health research. It's what I'm interested in. And these students that we had, two students actually on engineering placements, they were the ones coming to me, and basically what they were describing was that some of the factors that contribute to academic attainment gaps, which they thought was the fact that, particularly in engineering, because so much of the degree relies on you having a good relationship with your supervisor, because they might be an academic reference for you, or they know everyone in industry, that actually that was a real barrier for them, feeling like that if they had any issues, whether it was an academic issue or if they felt homesick or they weren't fitting in, they absolutely would not raise it with their tutor. And so I don't know if that fully answers your question, because we didn't intend to talk about mental health, but I suppose it's being open-minded that actually we don't need to be directly talking about mental health, and mental health to be the thing that's talked about. In terms of how we engage the students, sort of outside psychology, I think it has to be through students that relate to those students. There's no way that I could run a group or relate to a student that doesn't feel like they could relate to me. So I think it's engaging with the student groups, like the ones in engineering, or students with caring responsibilities, or refugees, whatever the student group, they need to have role models that they can relate to in order to really engage with the research. I suppose just to quickly add, in terms of your loneliness question, Neil, I agree. It's not an answer, more so a question, to add to what you were saying. But I find loneliness also interesting in the sense that I feel like a lot of people I talk to, whether at work, in my family life, or students, a lot of people say that they're lonely. And so I just find it really interesting that what does loneliness really mean? And if we're all lonely, does that mean that we're actually lonely? If we're all, can we relate by feeling lonely, even though we are lonely? But yeah, I just thought your comment was really interesting. I don't know if anyone else has any comments on around loneliness. Maybe Yvonne, particularly with your Chinese international students. I think you had a snowman photo that I thought was really interesting, actually.
Hi. I'm not sure if I can exactly answer your question, but I think one thing about your first question about what it means to feel lonely is that even now, after doing a project which specifically focuses on understanding the experiences and what it means to feel lonely for Chinese international students, I don't think I can give you a point blank answer as to what it means, because one thing that all of our participants very much said was that the feeling of loneliness just it sort of goes up and down like a roller coaster. Like what is associated with a feeling of loneliness, what exactly almost triggers their feeling of loneliness, varies depending on their point in time. And if we're talking about Chinese international students, it can very much vary depending on whatever point or whatever period they are in their journey abroad. So, you know, at the start of their journey, it very much focuses on the feeling of homesickness and being away from like familiar culture or groups or your social circles. And then later on, once they're integrated a little bit more, or they may have established some friendships or relationships that can mitigate that feeling of loneliness, it can be associated with something else that might have like a larger impact. Like, for example, some participants said, oh, at the start, I wasn't feeling lonely because everything was new and exciting. And then later on, they were like, oh, wait, things are starting to feel a bit uncertain. I'm beginning to feel a bit disconnected from university. More things are coming in. So I feel as if I can't speak for, you know, all the student population or even international students or even all Chinese international students. But I think in this group, the feeling of loneliness is definitely something that's very individual, personal, subjective as well. Like when you were picking up on I think that's why us choosing to use or choosing to introduce the idea of images for our methods has been very, very beneficial, and could possibly be considered for something later on in mental health research, because it really does help to better convey or help participants convey exactly what it is that they're feeling, or exactly what is it, like perhaps a scenario or perhaps like particular experience that helps them to sort of like connect or reflect on their feelings of loneliness, and that might help to like bridge some barriers into helping, you know, understandings of loneliness for people who are perhaps like outside I think mentioned before, outside of like the psychology field and outside the psychology department. That could help to bridge some better understandings. I hope that somewhat answers your question. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne. I just want to add that from our project, the participants also described some kind of acceptance towards the feeling of loneliness. So some of the participants did describe how their relationship with the feeling of loneliness has changed over the course, and I think that resonates with mindfulness teaching. When we have a feeling, it might be uncomfortable, but how do we deal with that? How do we relate to that? Do we do something, or do we learn to be with that feeling? Sometimes trying to do something might cause further problems and might be a part of the problem itself. So yeah, that's why we believe it's quite interesting to explore whether we can use mindfulness practices to help people, Chinese international students, to maybe relate to their feelings in a different way and really useful, helpful action for the next step. Thanks.
You probably get this question all the time, but I wondered, I find the principle of using mindfulness to perhaps do with loneliness really, really interesting. And I wonder if you think it has applications for other student groups as well. So I'm thinking, for instance, bringing in Rebecca's research about students who are also carers, and I can only imagine how lonely that might feel. And I wonder if there was some sort of model of mindfulness that seems to work well with Chinese international students. Do you think it could be adapted to use the similar principles with other students? I don't know if that's a question for Rebecca or Xi or Yvonne, but yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I believe so. Yes, I believe it's indeed have the potential to be used with different student groups. There have been more studies on the student group, the student population in general, than studies on more specifically focused on international students or Chinese international students. So adapt some of the some elements of mindfulness-based groups. But yes, I do think mindfulness can be applied where to bear in mind their different needs and the potential adverse effects of those practices. And there's a lot we know about this, more we don't know. So I think it's quite important to do further studies with specific student groups. Thanks, Emma.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. That was a really interesting question. I would say we haven't fully finished analysing all of our data, but I would say from what we have seen that actually student carers and parents are not necessarily talking about feelings of loneliness as such, because and it was interesting actually the quote that Gopinder shows about the lady who was saying, there's more to my life than this, and actually for student carers and parents, their studies is just a small part. They're not going to aspire to that sense of belonging that a more sort of traditional student might aspire to. So actually it's not so much loneliness as disconnection, isolation, and a lack of voice, I think, that are the problems there.
I think it's interesting that you bring up Gopinder's talk actually as well, because I remember writing down, I think, oh, isn't that interesting? I wonder if to some extent whether it not whether it matters, but it reminds me that people have different identities. And I suppose that quote with Gopinder, that actually I've got more, when I go home, there's more to this. And I suppose carers, or you have multiple identities in your life. So perhaps if you don't feel like you belong at a particular point of your time at university, could a protective factor be that as long as you feel like you belong elsewhere, or you belong to a group with one of your other identities, then does it matter completely if you're not always belonging to a university?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the comments there and the thinking. It's really interesting. The other thing to note, life beyond academia, when you go home, for example, we have these kind of intersecting vulnerabilities that exist along the spectrum for all. Could be, kind of, and how we recover from that, how quickly we're able to recover from those. you know, it could be kind of care work that we're engaged in, or whatever it might be. You know, that kind of adds another layer of pressure that, you know, to the kind of early career researcher. And that seems to be such a, you know, such an interesting space at the moment, where it just doesn't seem to be viable to undertake doctoral study, you know, unless you kind of, you know, unless you have kind of, I don't know, capital or some kind of privilege, if you like, to a degree. It seems to be unattainable, essentially, to engage in that type of work, which leads to kind of issues of equity, I guess.
I had a quick question for you, actually, Gopinder, as well.
Yeah.
I appreciate your research is focused on PGRs, but it made me think, like, how early does this concept of unbelonging kick in? Like, because if we're thinking about trying to tackle it or try to prevent it or better support our PGRs, is it early enough to look at graduates, or do we need to be thinking earlier, that, like, when does unbelonging kick in? Absolutely.
I think that's a very good point you raised there, and something we've been thinking about a lot. I mean, it's this idea of induction, but that actually we induct throughout the journey at undergraduate level, you know, or the student who's doing a foundation degree and been out of education for 10, 15 years, inducting them back into university life, whatever that might look like. And the context matters so much. Then inducting them into postgraduate study, a continuous, how we have, for example, for early career researchers, we have mentorship programs, you know, and senior academics have mentorship programs. We have reverse mentoring now. So why do, you know, there seems to be kind of a lack of support for students. You know, like, you know, the program started, here you go, off you go, you know. But now we're seeing a lot more kind of student transition tutors coming into play in my context in particular. And you know, so I think it begins, you know, again, it can begin very early. It can always be there. And I think it's about, in terms of mitigating that, you know, it's having somebody to talk to. So we have this kind of research breakfast meetings that we hold every week at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, or 9:15, just after the school run. I've got kids, others got kids, others got caring responsibilities, etc. Even if you haven't got caring responsibilities, that doesn't matter. You know, you know, you are not kind of exempt from this, you know, regardless of workload or kind of responsibilities you might have in life. So I think those kind of things you can't assume that either, because actually I find, hey, being busy, having kids, having care, you know, like going to school, running back and forth, that gets me away from my desk. Otherwise, it's difficult. I just don't know when to stop sometimes. And, you know, and I heard students saying similar things. You know, it becomes an unhealthy balance there. And I think just having somebody to talk to, having been a student myself once upon a time, can always, you know, thinking back to being an undergraduate, I remember how kind of, you know, it was very difficult. It was a culture shock, you know. So and being a first generation academic, that plays into it. But it could be a culture shock for somebody who may have material resource and hasn't been to university. We can't just assume that, because, you know, listening to an accent or, you know, kind of judging them from the color of their skin. You know, whiteness is a very flawed. Whiteness is very problematic as a term, as a concept. You know, we need to look closer. We need to go beyond the headline data. And when we're kind of exploring and look at that, that's why we use an intersectional perspective to try and tackle and move forward and create a theory, you know, I don't know, theory of change, if you like, in terms of engaging in inclusive frameworks within universities. Sorry for the rant there.
I feel like I could just listen to you talking about that forever, Gopinder. Joe, you've got your hand up, although you are a co-chair. Joe, you have your hand up.
I didn't want to like interrupt because I guess one thing hello everyone. I guess what I kind of wanted to ask about, yes, more really. Sorry, I'm very conscious of the time, so obviously I don't want us to overrun, and this could create quite a moment. But I sometimes wonder whether universities have been too quick to blame a lot of problems around isolation, lack of belonging, and disengaged, underrepresented groups on things like COVID and COVID challenges, and whether actually COVID brought to light what was previously, like, it's forced everyone to sit up and pay attention. I don't know whether anyone else kind of has anything to say on that in terms of how their research has kind of straddled that border of kind of COVID and non-COVID times, because I know we've got some of our later projects here.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. I think that's a really important point, and I would certainly say in our research, one thing that COVID has done is highlighted actually what universities can do for students who struggle to engage, for want of a better word, with studies in a conventional way, like a so-called traditional student does. It showed just what they could achieve and what they could do, but actually what we're finding now is that some of that is getting dialed back. So I think it's quite interesting, and maybe universities have kind of exposed themselves a little bit in that they've shown how far they can go and are willing to go when they have to, and maybe it'll become a little bit more difficult for them to take some of that support away.
I think that's a really interesting concept as well. We see, so I think, yeah, I suppose in principle I agree, and maybe COVID was just something that shone a light on some things that were already there. So I think we find, even if we take loneliness out of the equation and we look at well-being, for instance, there's this sort of belief that COVID made everything really, really bad and everything worse. But actually, when you look at sort of the presenting issues that students bring to counselling services or to personal tutors, or that really they haven't changed. I think COVID has just highlighted and perhaps widened some of the gaps that were already there, particularly when we look at some of the stuff that Kapinta was saying around the intersectionality. I think a lot of those gaps are already there. They've just widened as a result of the pandemic, whether it's loneliness that you're looking at, or academic attainment gaps, or feeling like you belong. I think, yeah, I think they were there, but I suppose a silver lining of COVID is that it's forced us to really have these conversations, because COVID has really exaggerated some of the things that were already there, maybe.